How y'all doing? I just want to try to get our last installment of our discussion of economic life in here. So, grab yourself a cup of mud or whatever you feel like drinking and pull up a chair. So, see Zombie back there. Oh, there's Zombie. Say hello to Zombie. Oh, she heard her name. All right, so in this final part here, a couple things I want to say. Um, First of all, in our whole discussion, we've been emphasizing pre-industrial or non-industrial modes of livelihood. Excuse me. And certainly Miller, in your chapter, also talks about industrial society. So you can read what she says about industrial society. But I also wanted to say something about globalization as an economic reality, and especially how globalization impacts culture around the world. Maybe we can even think of historically globalization having an impact on indigenous people. So if I go here to, I want to grab Barbara Miller's book here for a second, and I'm going way back here to chapter 1. And she gives us a definition of globalization. And she says this. She says, globalization refers to the increased and intensified international ties related to the spread of Western capitalism that affect all world cultures. So that is a very important idea. So the spread of capitalism that affects all world cultures. So we need to talk about how and why that happens. All right. So I need to grab some notes here for a second. And, globalization is a word that a lot of social scientists use. It seems like every introduction to whatever textbook these days, whether we're talking about intro to Soc textbooks or intro to anthropology textbooks, all want to have some kind of focus or theme of globalization. Even, look at the title of Barbara Miller's book, right? Anthropology in a Globalizing World. So, so social scientists are these days making a big deal about this process that we're calling globalization. So, hold on a second. So what we're really talking about, first of all, is the idea that globalization is not anything new. Capitalism as an economic system, right, is not very old, but it's, goes back several hundred years. Or maybe we could even talk about capitalism emerging out of feudalism or beginning to emerge out of feudalism back in maybe the late 14 or the 1500s. Mercantile capitalism. We had industrial capitalism. We now have post-industrial capitalism, and what all of those historical stages in the development of capitalism represent are or is the universalization or the growth of the market, right? An economic system that's based primarily on market relations, where everything is potentially for sale, including labor, right? There's a labor market, and the price that's paid for labor is, we call that the wage. And there are also markets for just about everything else. There's a commodity market, and there's a money market, and there's a credit market, right, and so on. So there are all these, capitalism is defined by all these different markets. Now, we would also say that in this history, capitalism has built into it, an imperative, since it's really a profit-driven system. It has built into it, for a variety of reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, but it has built into it an imperative to expand. Capitalism must constantly expand, must constantly grow. So Nancy Bonvillain, remember her? She talked about this in one of her books, and she said that the growth of capitalism, right, depended on the exploitation of land, labor, natural resources, and raw materials. And that capitalism, from its beginning in the 15th century, was pushing out from Europe into the rest of the world. Turn my page here. Into the rest of the world. All right. So what she's saying there is that capitalism has built into it this need to push out, right? To take over and to integrate and to build new markets, and also to find ever expanding sources of labor and resources and raw materials and things like that. So I'm saying that globalization is not really anything new, because when Christopher Columbus hit the shores of Hispaniola, that was globalization. That was Columbus bringing European capitalism, right, to the Americas for the first time. So the age of exploration was really the age of the beginning of the spread of capitalism. So globalization is not anything new. We maybe are living at the time in history when that process of globalization is the most developed that it ever has been. That we can truly say that for the first time in history, the entire globe, the entire world is integrated, right, under a single, globally expansive capitalist market, right, tied together by all other different kinds of relationships like technology, right, like the fact that we have satellite communications and we have, we have transportation technologies that allow the coordination of production chains all over the world, and so on and so on and so on. The idea that you get a pair of tube socks made in China and they're going to be sold on the shelf at the Walmart in Richland. That's globalization, right? This entire integration of the world capitalist, what we might call the world capitalist system. Okay, and it's been on its way to becoming what it is today for about 500 years. All right, everybody okay with that? All right, so capitalism has this tendency, this built-in tendency to need to expand. Now, what forms does that take, right? What form did that expansion take? Well, first of all, I'm going to use two words. I'm going to use the word colonialism, and I'm going to use the word neocolonialism. And these two words, colonialism and neocolonialism, maybe sometimes we might talk about imperialism or neo-imperialism. There really isn't much difference between them. These are processes by which capitalism pushed out and integrated these sources of labor and sources of raw material and so on. And they're describing a particular kind of relationship, right, between countries and regions within the world. So I got to hold this up. It's going to be a little difficult because it's kind of like looking into a mirror and a little hard for me to figure out my left from my right here. But I want you to look at this chart. This is my summary of the sociology or the social science of a guy named Emanuel Wallerstein, right, or Emanuel Wallerstein, who anthropologists and sociologists turn to talk about these different kinds of things. And when he described this capitalist world system through history, first of all, he said it's been emerging since the 15th century, right? And he talks about the capitalist world system as involving relationships between what he calls the core and the periphery, between core countries and peripheral regions. Now, core countries are more or less countries that maybe today we might think of them more like the first world, and peripheral countries are maybe more like the third world. And he also talked about some other regions within this capitalist world system, including, he talked about a semi-core and a semi-periphery, and these were countries that were kind of in the middle between the core and the periphery. I'm not going to worry about that so much. The definitive relationship of global capitalism is the relationship between core and periphery. Okay, but you with me so far? And if we look at that relationship between core and periphery, the nature of it is such that, I'm going to hold this chart up again. The nature of it is such that you see control, right, passes from the core countries down, right? So control flows downward. It takes the form of economic control, political control, military control, and cultural control. So maybe, I don't know if you can read my writing there, but that's what those words are. So economic control, political control, military control, and cultural control. And that control is imposed on these peripheral regions, and for the purpose of siphoning wealth, right, surplus out of the peripheral regions and accumulating that wealth, or accumulating that surplus back home in the core. So that process, that general process of imposing control from the core down to the periphery, and now siphoning or pumping wealth right out of the periphery, is the basic relationship that describes that world system. There was a guy named Romesh Dutt. Now, don't worry about him. I don't think I'll ever ask you a question about Romesh Dutt. But Romesh Dutt was an Indian civil servant. And as you all know, India, the country of India, was colonized by the British. And he wrote a history of that colonization, a history of India as a colony of Britain. And one of the things Romesh Dutt said, as he's describing that relationship, is he says, "Verily, the moisture of India blesses and fertilizes other lands." And that's what he was sort of very poetically referring to, the fact that Indian wealth was being taken out of India and used to develop Great Britain, not being used to develop India itself. So India really had no control over its own wealth. And that Britain moved into India, and they came there with soldiers, and they came there with politicians and so on, and set up the Indian economy not to benefit the development of India, but to benefit Great Britain itself. And that kind of relationship is what we would call colonialism. Okay, that's colonialism. So one form that this core-periphery relationship takes is the relationship of colonialism. So Bonvillain, when she talks about colonialism, she says that colonialism, right, is the way she defines it. She says colonialism is the policies in which countries establish colonies in distant places to exploit their resources and labor, and to establish settlements of their own citizens. Now, that's what I would call good old-fashioned colonialism, right? Or maybe classical colonialism, right? Everybody follow that there? So Britain, as an example, is setting up India, setting up the Indian economy, controlling that economy in such a way that the wealth and labor and so forth of India is used to the benefit of Britain, the colonial power, and not to the benefit of the country of India itself. So you might imagine the kind of consequences that colonialism could have on indigenous people. Think about Europeans coming to the Americas. So what they did when they came to the Americas was they, established political, military, economic, and cultural control. And they, how can I put this? They transform those places from indigenous modes of livelihood, like subsistence modes of livelihood, subsistence modes of horticulture, hunting and gathering, agriculture, and transform them into, for example, plantation systems, right, in the Caribbean. And now those plantations are set up as conduits through which wealth is going to be transferred from the Caribbean and accumulated in Europe. Go, review, if you had history, go review your history course, or look up something called the triangle trade, and that's what we're talking about here. All right. So maybe the consequences of colonialism on indigenous modes of livelihood are relatively obvious. Now we got another word, because this old system of classical colonialism didn't last forever. After, in fact, maybe we could even go back to World War One, and then coming into World War Two, we start to see the dissolving of a lot of these European style colonies. They get very expensive to maintain, very awkward to maintain. So a lot of countries start to dismantle their colonies. Some colonies are now able, after World War II, to withdraw from colonial control. So we get, wars of independence, wars of colonial independence in places like Algeria, and in places like Southeast Asia, and in places like Africa and Cuba, and so on. So we get these anti-colonial wars. In other situations, European countries simply cut their colonies loose. So again, if we went back to Great Britain, possessed Jamaica as a colony, and in the early 1960s, pretty much just grants Jamaica its independence. All right. Now, what I'm saying here is that even though these colonial systems kind of fall apart, they're replaced by, in contemporary capitalism, they're replaced by a brand new system of colonialism that we call neo-colonialism. So when you put those letters neo right in front of colonialism, it means the new colonialism, the new style colonialism. Okay. So you have an article in your book on Malawi, right? Malawi versus the World Bank. That is an example of what I would call the neo-colonial situation, of Malawi being in the situation as a neo-colony, not to any particular country, but to global capitalist institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. That's the whole point of that article. And that the way that this relationship, where did I put that? The way that this relationship, do I have it? I can't see because I'm behind the paper and I can't see where it is. The way that this relationship is now maintained is not through the old system of colonialism, of direct control, but countries are kept in that sort of peripheral situation through the mechanism of debt. Okay. So what happened to a lot of countries when they were coming out of colonialism is, again, their economies were set up, not, for their own benefit, but their economies were set up to benefit somebody else or some other country. So the situation we're now facing was, how are we going to make our economy work for us? And to do that, they needed money. They needed financial capital, right, to remake and to invest in their own economies. And that's where the debt starts. So what the article is going to point out is that, an institution like the World Bank and the institution like the International Monetary Fund, they work very closely together. In fact, sometimes even in a coordinated way. And they are going to dictate the terms under which this development capital is going to be loaned, right, to those countries. And usually through a process called structural adjustment. Usually it's in such a way that the country itself isn't necessarily benefiting. So, so there you have it. So we have colonialism and we have neo-colonialism, and now we come to the end of our discussion of economic life. And the next set of these kind of lectures that I'm going to give you are going to come soon, okay? And we're going to move on from economic life to talking about kinship and marriage. And won't that be fun? See, look, zombie's trying, no, that's a closet zombie. She's trying to get out, right? But that's a closet door. She's not very smart sometimes. Okay, there's well, when she goes and stands by a door, that means she wants me to let her out. All right, guys. Cheers. Take care now. Peace.